Hi. So I want to thank Frank for inviting me. It's great to be here. This is actually the first time I've done any sort of formal thing on the GRCC campus, so it's nice to be here. I'm going to talk about some research that we've been doing at Grand Valley. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that everything I'm going to talk about is done in collaboration with Todd Williams, who is also a psych faculty member at Grand Valley, and one of our students, Alex Dennison, who is a collaborator on some of this stuff on one of the papers we're writing and some of these studies, who is a GRCC alum, soon to be Grand Valley alum, and headed off to a PhD program in industrial organizational psychology. So it's been great working with him. We get, as you know, lots of students from GRCC, and we love the relationship that we get. The students come well trained from the classes you get here. So we hope to continue to have a productive relationship between Grand Valley and GRCC. So I'm going to talk a little bit about beliefs and health and our awareness of changes and aspects to ourselves. Most of what I'm going to talk about is beliefs. I'm going to get into health a little bit near the end, and I'll kind of tell you how that goes when we get to the end. So what I want to do is start out by defining, that's a big screen, what we mean by beliefs and kind of contrast that with some other things. So when we say we're studying beliefs, the way we define a belief is a statement about the truth value of something. And we measure it on a 9-point scale like this. So for example, to what extent do you believe that spanking is an effective means of discipline? And some students believe that spanking is not an effective means of discipline, so anybody who responds 1, 2, or 3, we would call a disbeliever. Some think spanking is effective. If you respond 7, 8, or 9, we'd call you a believer. If you are 4, 5, or 6 and you're not sure whether you believe this, then you're in the middle, and we don't invite you to be in our experiment. So a couple of points about this kind of way of defining beliefs. So one is it's on a scale. It's not an all or none thing. Another point about beliefs like this is, for our purposes, it doesn't actually matter whether spanking is effective or not, right? What we are asking people is, to what extent is this true? Is this statement true? We also can contrast beliefs with a couple of other things to help kind of clarify our definition. So one of the things that is different from beliefs is what we would call knowledge. So knowledge is anything that I can know or that I can kind of hold in my mind, right? So I know that people write stories about dragons. I could describe some of the properties of dragons. I do not believe that dragons exist in the world, right? I know that research suggests that genetically modified foods are safe to eat. Some people believe that they aren't. I know that some people believe that the earth is flat or that the earth is only 6,000 years old, right? That is knowledge that I have that other people believe this. I do not believe those things to be true, but I can hold in my head knowledge that I don't share with other people. Another thing that we can contrast beliefs with are attitudes, which are feelings, what we would call things that have a kind of affective valence where you feel good or bad about it. So for example, I may believe that spanking is an effective means of discipline. But I may think to myself, you know what, I don't like it. I don't like the idea of that. I don't want to do it. So I may not spank my kids even if I think it's effective, right? So my feelings could be separate from my beliefs. Or I could think, I know the research suggests that genetically modified foods are safe, but they just seem icky and weird and I don't want to eat them, all right? So what we are asking is about what's true in the world and the extent to which people think these things are true in the world. There was lots of research on knowledge and attitudes. In fact, there's a lot more of that than there is of research on beliefs. One of the reasons that we have chosen beliefs to study is that beliefs have a kind of educational relevance, which is to say, we may expect students in classes to learn about the evidence related to spanking effectiveness, and we may test them on the evidence related to spanking effectiveness. We may test them on the evidence related to a potential link between television violence and actual violence, but we don't teach students attitudes, right? We don't teach them how to feel about things. And so as an issue of sort of educational relevance, beliefs are things we potentially or evidence and arguments related to beliefs are things we potentially teach students, whereas we don't teach them about attitudes. Okay, so another issue about beliefs is that students and people in general occasionally encounter information that's inconsistent with their beliefs. All right, so imagine you're a student taking introductory psychology. If you come into the class believing that sexual orientation is genetically determined, right? A lot of people believe that. Lady Gaga kind of says that. If you read a textbook, so this is a paragraph from the textbook that I use in intro, and a lot of textbooks say similar sorts of things. You may come across this passage. So, a study found a concordance rate in twins of 20% for homosexuality and identical twins and 0% in fraternal twins. In another study, they found concordance rates for lesbians of 48% in identical twins and 16% in fraternal twins. The finding that a substantial percentage of identical twins aren't concordant tells us that environmental influences play a key role in homosexuality, although it doesn't tell us what these influences are. All right? So this is some evidence that may conflict with what you believe about homosexuality, and students may change their beliefs to bring them in line with this evidence that they are reading. Or they may not change their beliefs. They may be able to answer questions about this correctly without changing their beliefs, perhaps. And so you may be thinking, well, people, this is fine, but people hardly ever change their beliefs, right? And certainly there is some truth to that. Although we do find belief change in certain sorts of circumstances. So, for example, there are more people in 2018 who believe that global warming is real than there were, say, in 2010. Although, so we see some change in these kinds of things, although not total change. The percent of people who believe that the mass media is basically trustworthy or provides valid information has changed, and you can look at that by party affiliation. I mean, I'm not going to try to unpack that, but just to say that beliefs do change sometimes. In the context of experiments, we see belief change about certain kinds of issues. So in these kinds of cases, what tends to happen, and we're going to do something similar when I get to that in just a second, people would report their beliefs about some issue, and then you would read some information that may conflict with your beliefs, and we see if they change as a result of reading in the context of these experiments. So with things like nuclear power, climate change is tough to get a lot of belief change on, but you can get some belief change on climate change. The old weirdly persistent and hard to get rid of myth that we use only 10% of our brains. A lot of people believe that. We use 100% of our brains. I'm not sure how else to explain that. And weirdly, it's not as if you can just say to people, look, we use 100% of our brains, and then later that's what they'll say, right? Some people at the end of an intro psych course will still say, oh yeah, 10% of our brain, that's true, right? I mean, isn't that true? It's not true. But you can get some belief change, right? And of note, in these studies and in the studies we're going to do, when we talk about belief change, we're talking about change on a continuum, right? A few points on a scale, not necessarily all or none or wholesale change all the way to the other side. Okay, so what I'm going to do is address a couple of questions with some studies that we have been working on. One is, when beliefs change, to what extent are we aware of these changes? And you may think, well, that's simple enough. I may or may not change my beliefs, but if I do change my beliefs, I know about that, right? So that's one of the questions we will address. And then if there is any kind of variation across people in their awareness of belief changes, does this level of awareness of your belief change tell us anything else about you or predict anything else? Okay. So all of the experiments about beliefs that we do have a common kind of method. and then there's some variations that I'll tell you a little bit about. But basically what happens is at the beginning of the semester on an online questionnaire, we have people report their beliefs about a variety of topics. So spanking is the one that we're looking at in particular in this study. So we classify people as either believers or disbelievers in the way that I mentioned before. Then we invite the believers and disbelievers to come into the lab anywhere from about 3 weeks to 2.5 months later and participate in the experiment. When they come in, everybody reads a text that is either what we call a pro-text, which suggests that spanking is effective. It presents evidence and arguments saying spanking is effective. Or you read a con-text, which presents evidence and arguments suggesting that spanking is not effective. And the way the design works, people are randomly assigned to one text or another, and when you combine those with the beliefs that they reported at the beginning of the semester, we get this situation in which half the people are reading a text that is consistent with the beliefs they report or reinforcing the beliefs that they've already stated. We don't expect that those people will change their beliefs. And the other half are reading a text that is inconsistent or contrary to the belief that they stated at the beginning of the semester, and we think at least some of those people may change their beliefs, even if not all of them. In terms of the texts, basically everything we say in all of our texts is true, it's accurate. We cherry pick data, we cherry pick research to make these texts, is how that works. So the basic procedure is that first people, again, report their beliefs at the beginning of the semester in an online questionnaire, and they come in some number of weeks later. They read a text that is either consistent or inconsistent with their beliefs in the way that I talked about. Then they report their beliefs again, same 9-point scale, and that's how we measure whether they've changed or not. And then we ask this critical question. We say, think back to when you completed the online questionnaire at the beginning of the semester. You answered this question about your beliefs about spanking. Just tell us what you said back then. All right? So the idea of that question, that's a recollection or a memory question. And the idea is if your beliefs have changed as a result of reading this text, and you are aware of that change, you should be able to tell us that you used to believe something different than you believe now. And the only way we know that you used to believe something different is if you can accurately remember what you said, that you gave a different response. So the recollection question is how we determine whether you are aware of any changes that take place or not. Okay, so before I get started, I've got several figures like this. What we do for these is we take all of the believers, the people who respond on the high end, and we reverse or flip their responses so that in all the data I'm going to show, it's always the case that more extreme responses are lower numbers, so the believers or disbelievers. The more extreme you are, the lower you are on the y-axis. The higher you are, the more moderate you are on the y-axis. So the initial beliefs are rather extreme. We fix it that way because we only invite people with these extreme beliefs to come in and participate. And again, people either read a text that is consistent or inconsistent with their previous beliefs. And what we find, if people read a text that is consistent with their previous beliefs or reinforces their beliefs, we don't really see any belief change. And then when people try to recollect what they believed at the beginning, those beliefs match. Which is also not surprising. If your beliefs don't really change, then you should be able to tell us that you used to believe the same thing that you believe now, and that's all fine. So the question is, what happens when people read a text that is inconsistent with the beliefs they stated at the beginning of the semester? So the first question is, do they change their beliefs or not? What do you think? Yes? No? Thumbs up? Thumbs down? No? Yes? No. No. I mean, it's not, the text, it takes 10 minutes maybe to read. It's not a huge experience. All right. We do get belief change as it happens. Again, not all the way to the other end of the scale, but we get statistically significant. It's quite significant. So people do tend to change their beliefs. Right? So then the question is, if people are aware of these changes, they should be able to tell us that at the beginning of the semester they used to believe something different. So, can they do that? Probably not. Nope. Nobody ever lost a lot of money betting that people's memories are bad. In a lot of ways, our memories are not very good. All right, so what we find is that people make this recollection error, right? So essentially what the subjects are doing is they are acting as if the beliefs that they have now, right? You can see the recollections are much closer to the beliefs they have now than they are to their actual previous beliefs. So they're essentially acting as if the beliefs they have now have always been their beliefs. All right? So we interpret this as a lack of awareness of the change that has taken place because, again, if you are aware of a change in your beliefs, you should be able to tell us that you used to believe something different than you believe now, and people don't seem to be able to do that. In a second experiment, we replicated the same findings. So, right, replicating your results is always good, so we found that. And this is this is a statistical technique called a mediation analysis. And essentially what this does, it addresses a particular kind of question. So we say, okay, we find overall that people change their beliefs, and we find that memories are not very good. That doesn't necessarily mean that the belief change and the memory error are related to each other. They could potentially be kind of two unrelated things. But mediation is a statistical way of asking a question about whether the belief consistency of the text you read, so this is whether you read a text that's consistent or inconsistent with your beliefs, that influences your memory. And the question is, does this influence your memory in a way that is mediated by belief change? In other words, you read a text that's consistent or inconsistent with your beliefs, that in turn changes your beliefs, and the changed beliefs in turn influence what you remember. And what we find, this indirect effect being significant, essentially what that means is that we have evidence not just that people are making a memory error, but that the change in your beliefs seems to be what's driving your memory. All right? And so I'll come back to our interpretation of that later on, but this is important to part of our interpretation of what we think is happening here in terms of these memory errors. So in another study, we looked at the extent to which watching violent television makes you violent as a topic. In this study, we didn't have anybody read a belief-consistent text. Everybody read an inconsistent text, and we found, again, the same result, that people on average are persuaded to change their beliefs by the text that they read, and that they show poor recollection of their initial beliefs. So after doing a few of these studies on spanking and TV violence, in particular, spanking was a topic that we chose because we thought that the undergrad students who are our subjects would have polarized views on spanking, which they do. Some think spanking's effective, some think it's not. But also, we thought that undergrads were perhaps not all that attached to spanking as a topic. It's not very central to what we might call their worldview, right? Meaning, if spanking is not that important, we thought that would increase the chances that people would potentially change their beliefs. So after doing some studies on spanking and TV violence, we wanted to study a topic that we thought was more kind of important or more relevant, something that perhaps students have thought more about. So we decided to look at gun control. So the question stated in belief terms is, to what extent do you believe increased gun control will result in decreased gun violence? People are polarized on that. And if you read a text that is consistent or reinforces your initial belief on gun control, no surprise, people's beliefs don't change and their recollection is accurate. We really didn't know if people would change their beliefs about gun control. You know, we thought maybe this is a topic where people's beliefs are so firmly embedded that nobody's going to move at all. Also, it is not very often, if you're a psychological scientist, that the studies you run are potentially influenced by events going on out in the world. But as it happens, I mean, unfortunately, it's never all that long from one shooting to the next, and shootings are in the news, right, which is one of the reasons why we thought people may have more firmly embedded beliefs about gun control. As it happened, we started collecting data about a month after the shooting in Las Vegas, and through the middle of our data collection, that was when the shooting at the high school in Parkland, Florida happened, which you all remember, which was in the news more than most shootings. And we really didn't actually have any idea if that kind of event would influence our results or not. We didn't really have a hypothesis about that. So, people change their beliefs about gun control or no? Yes? Yeah? Yeah. In fact, to the exact same degree as they do on topics like spanking. So they seem to do that. We also didn't know, maybe if people thought a lot about gun control, they would be more aware of their changes if their beliefs change. And not really. We still see this significant memory error. So on a topic like gun control, we seem to get the same sorts of results. And again, we get significant mediation, meaning the extent to which the belief-consistent or inconsistent text influences your memory is mediated by belief change. So it seems that the text you read sort of influences the beliefs in turn influence your memory in the same kind of way as we got before. So, to come back to our first question, when people change beliefs, are they aware of these changes? What we found in these, and in fact we've replicated this in some other studies too, we consistently find people showing a poor ability to remember their previous beliefs after their beliefs change, which we interpret as a general kind of lack of awareness of belief changes. And so this research fits into other kinds of research. We are not the first people, certainly, to show that our memories can be bad. But there is research on other sorts of aspects of ourselves showing that when we change aspects of ourselves, we are not necessarily aware of it. So there is research on attitudes and emotions. Mental health following psychotherapy. Kind of weirdly, people sometimes do not actually get better as a result of being in therapy, but they think they've gotten better because they think that they were worse off than they actually were when the therapy started. So you ask them, are you better after 3 months of therapy? And they say yes, and partly it's because they just don't remember where they started. You find the same thing for people who go into treatment for chronic pain. Study skills workshops are kind of famous for not actually improving study skills, unfortunately, but students think their study skills are better if they've gone through a study skills workshop. And actually, the one that kind of caught my attention initially was this one on dating satisfaction. So, right, if you're dating somebody and 6 months later your relationship is better, people misremember their relationship as having been better than it actually was at the beginning, whereas 6 months later, if you've broken up and you can't stand the other person, you misremember the relationship as being worse than it actually was, right? So if you've broken up, you look back on the beginning and say, you know what, I never did like her. And your friends are saying, yeah, you did. No, I didn't. Your friends are probably right? And you are probably misremembering how happy or unhappy you were at the beginning of your relationship. Okay. So one of the things also about these studies in these other areas is that they look at people's awareness of changes to themselves, but they don't, with only one exception, they don't tend to relate variation in awareness to anything else. In other words, if some people are more aware of changes to their beliefs and others are less aware, is there any difference between those people? And so one of the things that we were interested in is this question of maybe people who realize that sometimes their beliefs change would be more interested or more willing to seek out information that they don't agree with. Whereas people whose beliefs change, but they don't know that, may be less interested or less willing to read new information about the topic. So that was something that we looked at also in a couple of studies. So in the TV violence study that I already told you about, the standard procedure that I've already shown you is up on the top. After doing that part, we had people engage in an article rating task where we gave them a series of titles to articles, and we said, we just want you to rate how interested you would be in reading articles, in reading each of these articles. So we gave them a list of 20 titles. 3 of them, in the title, it suggested that TV violence causes actual violence, and 3 of them, the title suggested TV violence does not cause actual violence, and then 14 were neutral, meaning they weren't about TV violence, right? So watching violence makes for angry kids, study shows, is a pro title. Television and violence, what we watch does not make us who we are, is a con title, and lots of others that aren't about TV. So they rated their interest in reading on the same kind of 9-point scale as we've used before. It turned out that people's ratings of the pro titles and the con titles were very highly correlated, so we combined the 6 TV violence articles together into a single rating of how interested are you in reading more about TV, and compared those to how interested you are in reading about other kinds of things. So one other note, before I show you the data on the interest ratings, with all of our studies, we get a pretty strong correlation between the amount of change that people experience in their beliefs and the degree to which their memories are inaccurate or their recollection error. And this is important. I'll tell you about this briefly and then tell you kind of why this is important. So it kind of makes sense, right? If you don't change your beliefs at all, you are unlikely to have much of a memory error. If your beliefs now and your beliefs in the past are the same, you have not much memory error. Whereas if your beliefs change a lot, right, 5 or 6 points on a 9-point scale, you have more potential to make this memory error. So the fact that these 2 things are correlated is important, because what we really want to know is not whether whether belief change predicts interest in reading. We want to know whether people's awareness of those changes predicts belief in reading. So that's down on the bottom. On the top, we just have the correlation. So what we do is just look at the correlation, or the extent to which people's interest in reading these articles is predicted by either how much they change their beliefs or their memory for their beliefs, right? And so what we find is that just changing your beliefs does not predict whether you're interested in reading more about TV or not, but the error, the extent to which you are wrong about your memory, does predict TV article interest. The negative correlation means the more error you have, meaning the less awareness you show, the less interested you are in reading more about TV. The more awareness you have, or the less error, the more interested you are in reading about TV. Also importantly, your error in your awareness of TV violence beliefs does not predict how interested you are in reading the filler articles, all right? But what's really a more important analysis is what's called a multiple regression. So essentially what we're doing in this analysis on the bottom is predicting how interested people are in reading by simultaneously using the amount their beliefs change and their accuracy in remembering their beliefs together. So in this analysis, what we can see is that the error in memory predicts how interested people are over and above or after factoring out the extent to which they've changed their beliefs. So what this really tells us is people's interest in reading about TV is not a function of whether they change their beliefs or not. It does seem to be related to whether they are aware of those changes. So 2 people who both change their beliefs about TV violence, one of them is more aware than the other. The one who is more aware of this is more likely to want to read new information about it in the future. In the gun study that I showed you about, we've got, again, the same procedure on the top. And in this case, we didn't want to just ask people about their interest. We wanted to give them a chance to actually read about the topic. So we have this open-ended reading task where this is what the interface looks like. So we told people, after they read the main text, we said, all right, we're going to give you a chance to read some new articles. We're going to ask you some questions about them at the end. You can read as many of these or as few of these as you want. You can spend as long or as little as you want. So the way the interface works is if you click on a title, that article will show up. You read it for however long you want. Then you click another button. It brings you back to this interface. You can click on a different title if you want. And you can go in and out of them until you are done reading. And then you click I'm finished down here on the bottom. All right? And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that since the subjects are doing this as part of a psychology experiment, right? This is not a class. They're not being graded. They don't really need to read anything. So that at least lends some validity to the idea that they would be reading things if they're interested in reading them, because they can just click, I don't want to do this at all, I'm done, right? They get the same amount of credit whether they read or not. So we have three articles that are pro-gun control effectiveness, or by the title they suggest gun control is effective, 3 that suggest gun control is not effective, and 3 control articles that aren't about gun control at all. Again, we see the same strong correlation between belief change and their recollections. And so now what we're looking at is the extent to which changes in gun control beliefs predict how many gun articles they read, and their awareness or the error in their memory predicting how many gun control articles they read. And we see the same correlations, right? So we see this significant negative correlation, meaning the more you are aware of changes in your beliefs about gun control, the more new articles you read about guns. But just changing your beliefs about guns does not predict whether you're going to read more information about guns or not. And also importantly, your awareness of changing your beliefs about gun control doesn't predict anything about reading articles that aren't about gun control, right? So it's not that the people who are aware of their beliefs are just interested in general and read anything you give them. They don't read the stuff that's not about guns. It only relates to their gun control, right? The gun control articles relate to their gun control belief change awareness. Again, we've got the same multiple regression where we look simultaneously at changes in their beliefs and awareness of those changes in predicting how many gun articles they read. And we find the same kind of result that we found with the TV, which is that the recollection error or the awareness of belief change predicts how many articles they read over and above or after factoring out belief change, but belief change does not predict how much they read over and above their awareness. Okay, so to come back again to this question, what we find is that if we look at awareness of belief change as a kind of individual difference, which is to say, right, in general, the evidence I showed earlier suggests in general people don't have a very good awareness of their belief changes, but it is also true that some people are more aware of these changes than others. And what we find is that the people who are more aware of these changes when they happen are also more interested in or more willing to seek out or read new information. People whose beliefs change but are less aware of that are less interested or less willing to seek out new information. Okay. So, I want to shift gears a little and tell you about bariatric surgery. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it is, and then I will get into a bit of why we're looking at this and what this has to do with anything. So, bariatric surgery is surgery for weight loss. There is a longitudinal study called the Longitudinal Assessment of Bariatric Surgery, which has been going on across 6 different surgical centers around the country. They've got around 2,500 patients have signed up for this. They get this surgery, and then they come in once a year over the course of 7 years. The study is over, so they finished the 7 years. At least the data collection is over. They would come in once a year for 7 years and have all sorts of medical tests, right? Weight is kind of the obvious one, but lots of medical tests about diabetes and liver function and all kinds of things. They also would fill out a whole slew of questionnaires about everything from their job satisfaction to their sex life to how they're feeling, all kinds of stuff. And so a lot has been published and written about this longitudinal study of bariatric surgery. There were two types of surgery that went on in the study. What's called the gastric band is sort of like a belt that goes over the top of your stomach and restricts food intake. The lap band is not used so much anymore as a surgical procedure. The Roux-en-Y gastric bypass is where they cut out they cut your stomach out over here and connect up part of the small intestine to this little pouch that now represents your new stomach. So most of the stomach and the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine, are bypassed. So this also restricts food intake by giving you a small little pouch where the rest of your stomach was. The stomach stays in your body. It just doesn't do anything anymore. So this was all done having nothing to do with Todd and I, of course. So just one bit of data on this. So this was published in 2017. This is the percent weight loss or percent body change as a result of the surgery. So one thing you can see is that the gastric bypass is much more effective in terms of weight loss than the lap band, which is one of the reasons why the lap band is not very popular anymore. But you can also see, right, there is a massive amount of health change for these patients. So they are losing, on average, around 34% of their body weight in a year, right? So if you can imagine losing a third of your body weight in a year, that's a lot. And what is really striking about this procedure compared to pretty much any other kind of weight loss is that people keep the weight off over the course of 7 years. So it drifts back up a tiny bit, but they finish the 7 years around 30% down from where they started. So this is a population who undergoes a massive change in their health status in a year, and then after that is largely, at least as far as their weight, is largely stable beyond that. So what does this have to do with anything? As it happens, my dad is a gastric bypass researcher and is one of the principal investigators on this. So he is one of et al. In Courcoulas et al. So we were chatting about research at one point. It was after Todd and I had the first paper on spanking was just accepted for publication, and I was kind of telling him about it. And he said, yeah, you know, it's weird that patients sometimes seem to be unaware of diseases or health problems that they've had. He talked about this one woman who, after the surgery, her type 2 diabetes went away, which happens in something like 60% of the people. You don't even treat the diabetes, it just goes away. And the doctor was talking to her and said, oh, your diabetes has gone away. And she said, I never had diabetes. And he flips through the chart. Well, yeah, it says right here, diabetes was one of the main reasons you got the surgery. She said, that must be wrong. I never had diabetes. So, you know, anecdotal evidence, but kind of suggested that here was a patient who seemed to be unaware of changes in her own health status, right? So we talked about this idea of, well, maybe along the lines of, you know, us finding people to be relatively unaware of belief changes, maybe people also are relatively unaware of changes in their health, which again may seem weird. You'd think, all right, I know if my health has changed or not. So I said, well, did you, there's this whole slew of questionnaires. Did you ask anything in this longitudinal assessment that could get at this? And he said, well, I don't know. There was dozens and dozens of pages of questions that they asked. A lot of it, they've published maybe 50 papers from this longitudinal study, but a lot of it still has not been analyzed. And so he said, I'll send you what we asked them, and you can kind of dig through it and see what's there. So as it happens, buried in what's called the SF-36, which is a very widely used questionnaire in which people report about their own health status. So it's 36 questions. It's split between what's called a physical composite and a mental composite, which means essentially questions about how you're feeling physically or how you're feeling mentally. And buried in there, question number 2, compared to 1 year ago, how is your health today? Or how is your health in general now? And so I saw that and I said, that's my question. And I said, so I talked to my dad, I said, has anybody analyzed this? And he said, well, no, nobody would have any idea what to do with that. That's just part of the questionnaire. We don't know what to do with that. So it said, all right, I know exactly what to do with this, right? So what's interesting about this question, it seems like a harmless enough question, right? It's the same kind of thing, I go see my physical therapist and she says, are you feeling better than last time? And I kind of laugh and say, you've asked the wrong person now. Let me tell you about that question. Right? But it seems like a hard enough question. I mean, a harmless question. But in order to answer this question, what you have to do is assess your health now, fine enough, go into your memory of yourself from 1 year ago, assess the health of that person, and compare the health of you now to the health of that person in your memory from a year ago. All right? And so in order to accurately perceive the change in health, you have to have an accurate memory of your health from 1 year ago. You can't answer the question without an accurate memory of your health a year ago. So the only way this question is of any use is if we have any information on people's health a year ago. Right? And as it happens, this is a longitudinal study, so every year for 7 years people come in, and every year they rate their health now, and they rate, compared to a year ago, how is your health now? So they look back on a year ago, and so we call this question number 2, change perception, meaning what change do you perceive about your health, and we can compare that to their actual health change score. So this SF36 gives us a kind of composite score on a 0 to 100 scale. So for each year, your actual change in perceived health we can define as your rating on year n, say year 3 minus year n minus 1, meaning year 2. Right? We can look at the difference between your year 2 rating and your year 3 rating as your actual change, and we can say in year 3, did you think you were getting better, did you think you were getting worse? And we can get some sense of the accuracy of your perception of your change by comparing it to your actual change. So this is kind of brand new. I'm going to show you just a little bit of data. We haven't published this. This is the first time I've talked about this. So I put together this slide to kind of illustrate how we are looking at this. So what we're talking about is this idea, the way we're framing it is in terms of concordance and discordance, meaning if my actual change in health is in line with my perception, if I am accurately perceiving my change, we would say I am in concordance. My health change is in concordance with my perceived change. If my actual change is out of line or not in sync with my perceived change, then I am discordant. So for example, suppose we have a person who from, say, year 2 to year 3 has no change. Right? In a lot of these 7 years, people obviously have a massive positive change the first year, and they say that and they perceive that. Then after that, most of them don't change a whole lot. Some of them certainly do, but it's certainly common to have no change over a year. So if your reported health is no change, then in year and say year 3, when you look back on the year before and say, is your health better, the same, or worse, if you think your health is better, when in fact it wasn't, then those two things are out of line, and you are what we would call discordant positive. The positive part of that means you're essentially overly optimistic, meaning you think you're better, but you're not actually better. If your perception is that you are the same as you were last year, you are in concordance, right? You can also be in concordance if your health is actually better and you think you're better. So if your perception matches, then you're in concordance. If, on the other hand, you think you are worse, then you are again discordant, but you are what we'd call discordant negative, meaning in this case, the negative refers to this idea that you think you're getting worse, but you're not actually worse, or you think you're getting worse to a greater degree than you actually are. So essentially, the way this differs from our belief research is that there's kind of two different ways to be wrong about your memory of your health changes. And they may have different consequences. You can be wrong on a positive end, or you can be wrong on a negative end. And so we've got just kind of preliminary data about this. So what we've got here, we've got the data up through the 5th year. So for each year, we have the, 0 to 1 is the year where they have these massive positive changes. from 1 to 2 and so on, they change less. And we're going to put them into more fine-grained categories, but for the moment, we've just categorized them as either concordant, meaning your perception or your memory matches your actual change, or discordant positive or discordant negative. So one thing to notice is the concordance rates, right? These are people whose memory of their health from a year ago is essentially accurate. At best, we've got 50%, or half the people are concordant in the first year because they've got these positive rates, or because everybody's getting better. Beyond the first year, less than half the people are concordant, right? So this general question, how aware are we of our changes in health? The broad answer is not that aware. Less than half the people seem to have a good awareness of this, right? And what's interesting also is that we've got this whole slew of people who are discordant positive, meaning essentially they're overly optimistic about their health changes, even though they're incorrect. And we've got another slew of people who are discordant negative, meaning they're overly pessimistic about their changes. And so we are in the middle of looking at this at a more kind of fine-grained detail. And another thing that we're doing with these data is trying to relate these degrees of concordance or discordance to actual health outcomes. So in other words, if you keep thinking you're getting better, even though you're not, does that predict any actual health outcomes, right? Maybe people who are overly optimistic actually take care of themselves better. Maybe they exercise more, maybe they eat better, maybe they lose more weight, maybe they're less depressed. So we don't have answers to those questions yet, but that is something that we're going to be looking at in the future. Okay, so to kind of wrap up, what happens when we change? It's not as if we are wandering blindly through life and we just have no idea what we're like or where we came from or anything, right? The story is not nearly so extreme as that. But perhaps to a greater extent than we may realize, we find that people are not aware of certain changes that take place in themselves, right? We tend to not have that accurate of a memory of our changes. And again, this is consistent with research in other sorts of domains. As far as we know, we're the first ones who have shown this with beliefs, but the question is motivated by research from lots of other domains. And we also find that people who are more aware of belief changes may be more willing to seek out new information on that topic. And potentially we think this is important. This may be part of a kind of larger puzzle about how you get people to engage in information they don't agree with, right? There's a lot of research on things like confirmation bias that suggests that people tend to seek out information that reinforces their beliefs or their opinions. They tend to ignore information that contradicts their beliefs or their opinions. And that's pretty well established. But maybe a piece of why that happens, or potentially a way to address that, is that to some extent people don't realize when their beliefs change. So you can imagine somebody saying, what's the point of reading this particular news source or this particular columnist? I know I'm not going to agree with this person. I know I'm not going to change my mind. So why bother even engaging with this information? Whereas people who are more aware that at least sometimes they change, at least a little bit, may say to themselves, well, I am willing to seek out information that I don't agree with. I'm willing to have conversations with people who believe different things than me. Sometimes I do change my mind, even if I'm not going to in this case. So potentially that's a piece of this kind of larger puzzle of how to get people to engage in information they don't agree with, which we all know is hard, and we all know the internet has made it a lot easier to avoid anything that you don't agree with. In terms of health, this idea of lack of awareness of changes in our health, we find people kind of all over the place, right? And it's not even the case, you can't see that from the table I showed, it's not even the case that people are consistently discordant positive or consistently discordant negative. Individual people jump around through the course of the 5 years. So what we seem to find is not only overall not very good awareness of health changes, but just kind of huge variability in people's awareness of changes. So one of the things that I like to talk about in class whenever we're talking about experiments And there are plenty of ways you can phrase this, but this question of kind of who cares, right? Beyond researchers who get to publish papers, and that's nice for them, and hopefully somebody talks about them, do people outside the research world care about this? So I have a couple of potential answers for that. One is this kind of research suggests that surveys, opinion questionnaires, health questionnaires are probably well served to sticking to questions about how you feel now, right? So questions like, are you feeling better than last time you came to my office, sounds like a harmless question, but it's probably not a very good question, because it requires people to accurately remember how they used to feel, right? Asking people, do you feel differently about the president now than you did 6 months ago? Is, again, a question that would have a sort of questionable validity because it requires people to remember how they felt about the president 6 months ago. So sticking to questions about how people feel now would be one potential bit of advice that we could give. I kind of already talked about this a little bit, but the potential one potential reason why, there's no way this is the only reason why people don't engage with information they don't agree with. But one potential reason is that they just may be unaware that in fact they do sometimes change. All right, and I want to just finish with a little bit of kind of theoretical interpretation, or what we think is happening, or how we interpret what's going on here. So there's a lot of research on memory that suggests that memories are constructive or reconstructive. So essentially what that means is, and this is, we are certainly not the first people to find this or point this out, memories are not like opening a computer file where information is just sort of stored and you can pull it up and look at it. Rather, what seems to happen is when we remember something about ourselves or something in our past, we construct these memories from information that is available or salient at the time we are trying to do the remembering. And so what we think is happening is, especially in the case of beliefs, that we've got a few different sources of information that are kind of used when you construct your memories of what you used to believe. Certainly we've got some stable aspects of ourselves, right? Everybody doesn't swing wildly on their gun control beliefs. A lot of people, around a third, don't change their beliefs at all after reading a belief inconsistent text. We also have biases and expectations, so people may think that they change their beliefs, they may not think they change their beliefs, that kind of thing. But we think what we are dealing with in our experiments is these kind of contextual factors, which is to say, anytime that I'm trying to remember what I used to believe, part of what I do is create these memories just based on what's going on around me, what is available in my head at the particular moment. So at the time people are trying to remember their previous beliefs, their current beliefs are very salient and available to them. The fact that they just read all this information suggesting something is also salient to them at the moment. So those sorts of contextual factors may, we think, are a lot of what's responsible for these errors in memory. And as I say, it's consistent with other research suggesting these types of memories are constructive. There's a lot of research about memory errors in various sorts of ways. Okay, so with that, I will stop, and thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, and that's it. Thanks.
It really comes down to this slide, and it has to do with remembering. It's somewhat of an epistemological question. I would argue that recollection is not self-constructed, but is socially constructed, from my perspective. And so contextual factors, looking at people who remembered or didn't remember, do you have any data on if they changed their social group? Because social group has a lot to do with memory. Think of Bob Keegan's work around doing therapy and being able to reveal unhidden, these unknown assumptions that were causing people to behave dysfunctionally in some way, and that through therapy you could reveal those assumptions, these dysfunctional assumptions, but unless people created a new social network that allowed them to move down a particular path, when he reconnected with them a year later, if they hadn't created a new social network, they actually had forgotten what was a profound understanding of the root of their dysfunctionality, but it took others to help them really solidify that memory.
That is really interesting. We don't have any data directly on that. I could only speculate about whether our subjects are having any sort of social group change, and my prediction would be no. They are coming in, these experiments are sort of innocuous. You sign up for them as part of intro psych and you come in and do this. Dan Kahan has some work on beliefs and how they're constructed and says something I think kind of similar, which is that a lot of our beliefs, in fact, one of the things Todd and I are working on is this idea that not just our memories of our previous selves are kind of constructed, but that our beliefs at the moment are also constructed in a similar sort of way. And Kahan has argued that people's social status within a group or their membership in a group goes a long way towards determining people's beliefs. So for example, things like climate change, right? There are a number of people who, if you ask them, especially elected representatives, it turns out a lot of elected representatives, far more elected officials say climate change is not real than people in the general public. And what may be happening is they think to themselves, I am part of a group that opposes these policies, and so my beliefs arise from my membership in this group. If I claim to believe something different than what the group believes, I'm going to lose my group membership. And so belief is not solely a matter of analyzing the evidence, right? It is part of this kind of group membership. I think that none of that is happening in our studies just because, or at least I have no data on that. Subjects are sitting by themselves in a cubicle reading evidence and responding by themselves. So there is no social interaction. So I think that's an important part of our beliefs and probably our reconstruction of our beliefs. But I'm not sure that we're tapping into that here.
But you reconnect with them some period of time later.
They fill out the questionnaire online, so they don't see us when they fill out the questionnaire. Then we invite them by email to come into the lab and do the experiment. So they come in once. They fill out the questionnaire online, and then they come in once. Yeah.
So you said you only invite people with strong beliefs. Do you think that could have an effect on people thinking more automatically on their beliefs, and then when they're doubting themselves reading these articles, having a more controlled thought process where they're more deliberate in it, and that could affect their recollection?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, we pick people whose beliefs are polarized.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily know how strong they are. One of the reasons we started doing spanking in the first place was that we thought, right, it's something that we've always been aware that we don't know, which is if someone says 1 to 9 scale spanking effectiveness, I'll say an 8. Does that mean, or maybe that's a bad example because they probably haven't thought about it. Let's say TV violence, right? Somebody says a 2. Absolutely not. We don't know if they have thought deeply about this and have a well-formed opinion, or if they're saying, I don't know, no, that doesn't sound right, 2, right? Where essentially their belief is constructed on the fly when we ask them the question. And we don't really know which of those are happening. We suspect it may more be the latter just because we get this belief change. And probably the more well-developed the beliefs are, the more you'd find this kind of prediction that I think you're making where, it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of research in attitudes, which I talked about, where there's a sort of assumption that anytime you read information that's inconsistent with your attitudes, your automatic response is going to be to generate arguments against it, to try to maintain your attitudes, right? So something like abortion, nobody's mind was ever, I shouldn't say ever, but people's minds are not going to be changed on abortion by going to a picket line and yelling, regardless of which side you're on, yelling at people at the other side. Nobody's really taking those arguments seriously, right? What they may be doing is automatically generating a bunch of counter-arguments. And there's this idea of the backfire effect, which is funny because the backfire effect refers to this idea that if you read information that's inconsistent with what you believe or your attitudes, you will argue against it so strongly that you'll actually move in the opposite direction. And apparently this belief in the backfire effect has become so strong that there is talk in the climate science community where people say we actually shouldn't tell people that climate change is real because we'll just get, everybody knows backfire. Backfire is all that's going to happen. And at least my look at the literature, I think there are a few legitimate examples of backfire, but mostly what people call backfire effects aren't even really backfire effects. So I think it's not nearly as strong as what a lot of people think. And in fact, we don't find any backfire effects at all. So that's kind of a long answer, but I think underlying it is this idea that it is not clear to us how well established the beliefs are, even though the people are polarized. The people in the middle also, they may be in the middle because, right, TV violence, at least, you know, it's not my area, but from what I know of the published literature, it's really not clear to what extent violent television makes you violent. Certainly there is legitimate research on both sides. So you could have a very well-reasoned opinion that lands you right in the middle of these things too.
Free knowledge. All you do is ask questions. You don't want me to ask another one. Because I have a couple.
I say that to my classes sometimes when they do these group presentations, and eventually they start to get the idea that, you know, we don't really like Wolfe's questions, so we should start asking more questions, because once he starts, he'll say, can you go back to the slide? Yeah, there. The y-axis was not clear on this, and then the student who presented it, you'll find out if they really know what the y-axis is or not, and sometimes they don't. Jake knows what I'm talking about. Jake's, yeah. So, anyway.
We will discuss the backfire effect in social psych. We actually already did. Thank you. Have a great end of your semester. Appreciate you being here. Please, again, thank Dr. Wolfe.